Okay, here we are again for the second stab at answering Braxton's 10 questions for atheists in 2021. Moving on to questions 6 to 10. Now, of all the questions that he asked, the question that piqued my interest the most, I really want to get my teeth into, is question 10. And I did consider doing that at the start of this part, but I won't. I'll stick to the original order. You know what YouTube's like now. As long as I put the timestamps, it'll chapterize, so you can go straight to that answer if that's what that's what floats your boat. Chaps and chapesses, you can do that. I'm going to stick with the original order. Now, when I first tried to answer question 6, you have to understand, right? The first couple of questions, Braxton says question 1, question 2, then he stops doing that. And when I first listened to the video, that is all that I did. I listened to the video, I wasn't watching the video. And question 6 just segued into question 7. And I thought it was all one question. And so let me play them both together, and you can maybe understand the misunderstanding that I was labouring under for a period of time.
What's your favorite film or television series? Contingency arguments for God's existence can be framed in a number of ways, obviously, but pick one, and what's your favorite response to this sort of contingency argument? Or if you're really ambitious, what's your favorite response to contingency arguments in general?
So maybe if you're watching that, you maybe won't be able to see that as just one question, but I just saw that as one question, or heard it as one question. And I thought, well, I'm familiar with arguments from contingency, but this is a new one on me. I'm trying to work out what it could be. And I'm thinking, well, could it be something like I give a favourite film series, and then the apologist says, well, to have a favourite film series, there has to be a favourite film series enabler. And that would have to be a sentient agent, and that sentient agent we call God or something like that. I'm thinking, well, this is a very contrived way to make a point. And I actually Googled for it and couldn't come up with anything. And it was only the next day when I listened again, but actually watched it, I realised, thankfully, it was 2 separate questions. So I'll answer it as 2 separate questions. Favourite film or TV series? I'm going to go with favourite film series. Can I just say this question is a bit of fluff, right? It's a profoundly disappointing question to include in this, because it's just like a bit of matey, chummy, well, let me ask you a nice question in between these deeper questions. I could do without that. But however disappointing the question is, I'm such a charismatic individual that I hope that my answer will not be as disappointing. Because fortunately, pure happenstance, my favourite film series by a long, long way is The Lord of the Rings. Love the book. I love it's the only films that I've watched half a dozen times, even though they're 3 of the longest films I've ever watched. Watched the whole thing half a dozen times. I doubt there's any other film at all that I've watched more than 3 times. So it's pretty special to me, but the reason that I find it interesting here is not for the reasons that I enjoy Lord of the Rings. It's because, as I understand it, there's a lot written about this that I haven't read about. I know it's been written. I'm just giving you my views here. But I know that Tolkien had intended to write this along biblical lines. He kind of wanted to recreate from fresh cloth his own creation myth and sort of whole, almost like a religious text, almost like a mythology and everything else that would go along with it. That was what he tried to do, hence the Silmarillion and some of the background texts. I don't really know how the Hobbit fits into all of that. That was maybe before he had the grand plan for it all. I don't know, but and if you look at the Silmarillion, you can see the parallels in the Bible. It starts off with a creation story. Rather than God speaking the world into existence, he sings it into existence, and it's very polytheistic, just like those very early Genesis texts are, because of when they were written, and the societies were polytheistic societies that those stories came from. And you have the same kind of thing, and rather than the devil as a sort of fallen demigod, you've got that Sauron occupying the same role. I mean, it's just similarities all the way down. Rather than the lineages of David and Jesus of who begat who, you've got the lineages of the elves, and then interspersed with these things, just like in the Bible, we have these different stories that tell different things, and they don't really sit together very well, some of them, just the same as they don't in the Bible. It's a little bit, the Silmarillion is a bit of a mishmash in the same way, which is kind of fascinating. And then that's kind of like the Old Testament bundling loads of things together is the Silmarillion, and then the Lord of the Rings is like the New Testament. We're now focusing on a more modern, on the here and now almost. We're viewing it in the here and now, and it's in much more detail, you know. And that's all interesting. But what's fascinating for me, of course, is that whereas the Bible was written 2,000 years ago, and so the New Testament was written not entirely contemporaneously. It was like written 3 or 4 decades or whatever after the event, I think, up to about 100 years after the event. Depends on which book you're looking at. But the Lord of the Rings is written 2,000 years sort of after the... well, no. The Lord of the Rings is written by somebody, a modern person who's living almost 2,000 years after the New Testament, right? So when Tolkien is writing his equivalent, he's viewing it not through the lens of somebody living 2,000 years ago, but he's viewing the whole New and Old Testament from somebody living in modern times. And as somebody else living in modern times, when I look back on the Old Testament and New Testament, what I see is the fall of magic from the earth. Right. You look through the Old Testament is much more magical than the New Testament. The miracles and the things that happen are, people are getting turned into pillars of salt. Oceans or seas are getting parted. Amazing things seem to be happening all the time. But gradually it gets more and more mundane as you go along. And frankly, the New Testament is way more mundane. I suppose Jesus rises from the dead. That's about the only really amazing thing. Yeah, he divvies up some food and makes a bit more food, but it's kind of parlour tricks compared to the stuff that had happened. Compare that to the life of a Christian living today or in Tolkien's time, last century, and it's a much more mundane world. So think about what happens in Lord of the Rings. And so there's the bits that Tolkien's got in there, the equivalent of the Old Testament and the New Testament in some ways. That's how I look at it. But there's also the sort of historical perspective of looking back on the fall of the decline of magic from 2,000 years later. Because, of course, throughout Lord of the Rings, the elves are leaving, and with it, magic is going to sort of leave Middle-earth. And so the magic's diminishing. The dragons are going to go, and the trolls are going to go, and the orcs are going to go. Sauron's defeated. The dwarves are just going to disappear into their minds. As Elrond asks Gandalf, like, who's going to look after Middle-earth? And Gandalf says, well, it'll be the humans. It'll fall down to man now to sort of inherit Middle-earth. It's going to be left to man. And you can imagine if you went forwards from the end of Lord of the Rings 2,000 years, what you would have is humans all over the place. The magic's gone. It's a much more sort of mundane place. And all there is these tales from 2,000 years earlier of this amazing magical world that no longer sort of exists anymore. And so that's an amazing parallel, I think, to the Bible. There's no more Leviathans or Nephilim or all this kind of stuff anymore. That's all this amazing stuff's in the past. And it doesn't exist anymore now. Of course, I can put my cynical hat on and explain why the Old Testament can be more magical than the New Testament, because it's written a few hundred years in the past so you can make it up, and why you can fit more in the New Testament than you can in contemporary society because everything's evidenced. You can't have a sea parted now because you make a claim and we just look at the satellite imagery and say, well, it hasn't done, I'm afraid. So, it's cynical hat on, I can explain that away. But the similarities of the experience of somebody writing an equivalent to the Bible with Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and what's in the Bible, I find is kind of fascinating. That's not why I enjoy watching them, but it's a fascinating thing nonetheless. Okay, on to the next question.
Contingency arguments for God's existence can be framed in a number of ways, obviously, but pick one, and what's your favorite response to this sort of contingency argument? Or if you're really ambitious, what's your favorite response to contingency arguments in general?
So I always think these are arguments that you cannot ignore, however many times you go over them, because they are kind of one of the last places of intellectual refuge, I think, for Christianity. After all, I mean, I think I may have, I don't know if I answered a similar question last year in the top 10 with a clip from Daniel Dennett, which pointed out, I won't play it again in case I did, but he sort of says, well, whatever happens, whatever our explanation for how it all began and what the universe is all based on, it's going to seem fantastic to us. So the sort of fantasticalness of it all can't be our metric by which we judge these things, because there are no non-fantastical alternatives. And this is maybe why this is one of the last refuges, and maybe always will be. It's profoundly disappointing to think this, but it could well be that there are things about the nature of our universe that we can never fully answer. They might not just be outside of our understanding, but outside of our inquiry, right? That just might be the way it is. That might not be right. I might be wrong. That's the kind of thing people have said for, over lots of things for centuries, and then end up very red-faced, sometimes in quite short order. But that could be the case. But it does seem to be one point of last refuge. Two of the problems that I have with the sort of Christian assertions is that one of them is that when you frame these kinds of questions, it's always talking about causal chains. And when we're talking about causality and causal chains in this way, we really are talking about temporal causality. You can hear people framing ideas of what they say is atemporal causality, but it's a very separate thing. That we might be still calling it causality, but we're talking about what appear to be qualitatively different things there. The talk about having a prior cause is I think really what we're talking about is a temporal thing, and that we can't have some kind of infinite regress with that. The problem with that is, and positing that there must be this sort of solution that breaks it, is that we're talking about the foundation of the universe as the foundation of time itself. So we're either talking about something atemporal, or we're talking about another temporal realm outside of this temporal realm. Either God is atemporal, which brings its own problems, or God exists in another temporal realm outside of this temporal realm, which just adds another temporal realm to be explained. The problem is that we're discussing issues that are issues of temporal causality, and that is the issue, outside of time. As if A, that makes any sense, I think, or two, that we're in a position to discuss that with any degree of certitude. And I really don't think we are. It's so outside our sphere of understanding and experience that we really need to tread very carefully when we talk about things like that. So that's the first issue that I have with it. And of course, it's framed in a way that, well, it can't just be a thing, can it? It can't just be a set of laws or something. No, it has to be a sentient agent. Right, it has to be a sentient agent. Why? Because we're using this argument to say that God must exist. Right? It's kind of almost seems very cart before the horse way of doing things. And the big problem that I have, some Hindus, their conceptualization of Brahman is quite interesting. Brahman would sort of operate it's maybe one of the only gods ever believed in that as I understand it, that has some of the same qualities of omniscience and omnipotence and being everything and all this kind of stuff. But their concept of Brahman is much more neutral. It certainly seems a lot more realistic to me. Brahman doesn't give a crap about us. Doesn't give a crap about morals or anything like that. It's above all of that. It's kind of a grey bleakness, really. It's not good, it's not bad. Brahman isn't right or wrong, or it doesn't get angry, it doesn't get sad. It's above all of that. It doesn't have that human side to it, and that makes sense. The lesser gods within their pantheons have these characteristics, but Brahman seems to have the characteristics that I would expect it to have, right? The problem that I have, this is, well, amongst all the other problems that I have with arguments for contingency, is that they're not arguing for a Brahman, they're arguing for Yahweh. They're arguing for a God, this sort of necessary being, that's sort of the one necessary, non-contingent thing that exists on which everything else is based, that just must exist in exactly the form it is, and yet somehow it's so idiosyncratic, it beggars belief. This necessary being, right, is concerned about whether a species of apes is boiling baby goats in their mother's milk. Is seriously concerned about whether we would put an ox and an ass on the same yoke. I mean, just these two things. This is the problem with Christianity, is that it tries to cover too much ground, I think, with one God. It wants the God to be this little idiosyncratic, particular thing that is interested in the minutiae of whether we're masturbating in our bedrooms, and yet it wants it to be this overarching, omniscient, omnipotent, grey force that is the necessary being for anything and everything that has ever been in existence and ever would be. And those two ideas are just so far apart that to try and fit them both together just seems one of the most nonsensical things. So if you wanted to use one of these arguments from contingency to leave a door open for some kind of necessary thing, then fine, okay? It sort of makes philosophical sense for me. To say that it's a sentience makes less sense, because sentience is every example of sentience that I have experience of is complex. There isn't a simple one, and yet I'm being told that this sentience, which is way greater than any other sentience that I've ever experienced, is simplicity itself. Well, okay, I can only take that your word for that, right? I have no examples. There is no precedent for that. So immediately that's becoming, it seems like you're adding a level of contrivance that makes things worse, purely because you're trying to evidence God through this argument from contingency. But then you're going to add all this extra bit, all these idiosyncratic parts of your God, which don't really fit with this kind of universe creator that you're trying to posit in your argument from contingency. So those would be the issues that I would have.
On your understanding of Christianity, what does it take for a person to become a Christian and experience everlasting life?
So my understandings for this and for the next question are quite complicated, because I know enough about Christianity to know that not all Christians think the same thing, right? And Christians often get quite hot under the collar with other Christians over these issues. My understanding is, to become a Christian, you need to accept, this is the sort of technical definition from the word go, was a Christian is somebody who doesn't necessarily think that Jesus is the Son of God, thinks that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. That is like your baseline characteristic that you would want to have. But of course, the usage of words change. Some people would regard themselves as a cultural Christian, even if they don't believe that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah or the Son of God anymore, but they'd still say they were Christian because their parents are Christians and they've been brought up in a Christian society. It isn't for me to say that they're not a Christian, right? That's an argument that you can have as somebody who uses the label of Christian to define themselves. But these things are quite sort of open-ended, I think. From my perspective, I think it's sensible for me to add that Jesus is the Son of God. That would make sense for me nowadays. Maybe not 2,000 years ago, but nowadays I think that would be a sensible thing to add on there. But like I said to you before, there's plenty of Christians in the UK who don't believe in God, but they still call themselves Christians. So I don't know. Now, in terms of experiencing everlasting life, well, again, I know that Christians believe different things. We'll move on to this in a minute, I think, with this next question. But I think for most Christians, you experience everlasting life pretty much whatever you do. I'll experience everlasting life. It might not be a very good everlasting life, but it doesn't really. The everlasting life part doesn't depend upon asking Jesus for salvation or whatever. To experience the good stuff, which never really sounds particularly, it always sounds a bit stultifyingly boring to me, actually, the whole business of heaven and an afterlife, and totally at odds with the nature of what I am as a mortal beast. You know, it sounds scary to me. I would have to be, I've said this before, my brain, I'd have to be reconfigured in such a way that it wouldn't really be me anymore. I mean, the idea of living for 1,000 years appeals. The idea of living for 10,000 years is starting to I'm getting a bit of a nosebleed already. I know people who are like in their 80s and 90s and have had enough, quite honestly. They've seen enough. We're novelty-seeking creatures. The idea of living for 1 trillion years is truly frightening. The idea of living infinitely, I mean, yeah, sure, maybe God reconfigures me so I'm compatible with everlasting life. Okay, maybe so, but is that really me anymore then? How much reconfiguring has to take place, and is it really me anymore? These are questions that I've asked myself over the years with regards to religion, and asked religious people how they feel about those things. And I think a lot of the time they just don't think about them, to be quite honest. But those are questions that I ask. But I think, as I understand it, from most Christians' perspective, I'm going to experience everlasting life whether I believe in God or not. A lot of the Christians in the UK sort of have this position, well, as long as you're a good person, you'll go to heaven. Others would think differently, and they'd say, well, you're going to experience everlasting life, Jim, but you might not like the form it takes. But we'll move on to some of that, I think, in the next question.
Whether you think anything in the Bible is true or not, do you think that the Bible, or any passage in the Bible, seems to teach eternal conscious suffering in hell? Maybe you think it teaches universal ultimate salvation or annihilation, the idea that people will no longer be conscious but will be annihilated and no longer have a conscious experience of anything. And I should say, I'm partly asking that question because a friend of mine, Chris Date at Rethinking Hell, would be happy to have a discussion or a debate on the subject of whether any Bible passage teaches eternal conscious torment.
So just let me preface my answer to this by saying that one of the observations that I've had in my dealings with Christians on YouTube and beyond, during discussing these things, is that there's a bit of a sort of, I suppose you could say, a bait and switch or a shell game that sometimes gets played. Whereas if you discuss what Christians actually believe, that the response that will be thrown back is, but that's not what it says in the Bible. And if you start discussing what it says in the Bible, and it gets a bit tough, it might say that in the Bible, but that's not what Christians actually believe, right? So it's like, whichever one you go for, well, it should have been the other one, right? And I'm sure you can probably, even though you're on the other side of the fence, appreciate that does tend to happen. So my understanding of this, and my understanding, I'll tell you where it largely comes from, a couple of lecture series that Yale University make freely available. Really good series. In fact, I'll link them in the footnotes. There's about 30 lectures in each one. They're complete sort of undergraduate lecture series, one on the Old Testament and one on the New Testament. And I've listened through to each one of them twice. And my understanding of it is that generally what the Bible teaches is very different. Of course, the sort of Jewish view is different again, and to the Christian sort of interpretation of the same thing. But I think a sort of reasonable interpretation is that what is being taught is that the afterlife is kind of like a reincarnation, but not a soulful spiritual rebirth as we would as Christians would think about it today, but a physical remanifestation on earth. Not necessarily with a physical body that we have now. I think the word is pneuma, which you get pneumatic from, which means the stuff of the air. Because of course the Greeks had a big influence on this because of when the New Testament was written. Their views were that the air gives us life. You take somebody's air away, they die. So they believed that there's a sort of a property of life within the air. And so, like, the pure essence of life was within the air. So this new pneumatic body, this body made of pneuma, would be a pure body. It would be the pure essence of life, which they thought was in the air. And that was what possibly your rebirth would be, rather than a physical manifestation in human form. That's how I understood what I was hearing about these professors talking about how they understood, how they'd interpreted this. And that certainly makes a lot of sense. Well, I mean, it doesn't. It's gibberish. It doesn't make any scientific sense, but it's kind of what they believed. And obviously, that brings up it's sort of, God must have a storage space somewhere, mustn't he? Like a big hard drive, because obviously your bodies all rot away, and with it your material brains. So until he re-embodies you with this new pneumatic body made of air, he's going to have somewhere to store your mind, I think. I don't know. So I don't know how that works. But obviously the Christian interpretations have changed over the years, and with it, understandings of heaven and hell. But I think it is fair to say, which is the point that you're making, which is that a lot of the modern understandings of eternal torment and stuff like that, I think some of that comes from the book of Revelation and lakes of fire and wailing and gnashing and teeth. And, you know, it all sounds like it doesn't sound like an Hieronymus Bosch picture. That's why Hieronymus Bosch painted his pictures, because that was the sort of idea of hell that he was trying to portray. But the idea of this kind of soulful ascending to heaven, and heaven being this sort of, I don't think that's what's in the Bible, and I don't think that's the most obvious interpretation of it. I'd agree with that, But that isn't what Christians tend to believe now, right? Most Christians don't believe that you're going to be reincarnated in a body made of air on the earth, because, well, for starters, we know that the air just has oxygen in it. It's not some magical life-giving thing. It's just that we need oxygen, and that, the science has kind of messed that up a little bit over the years, hasn't it? And the ideas that Christians have has changed over the years. So what do I think the Bible teaches about hell? I think it's open to interpretation. The Jews generally interpret it one way. Christians have interpreted it other ways, and those interpretations have changed over the years, probably partly as a result of science, but more probably as a result of particularly the Catholic Church wanting to get everybody to do whatever it wanted to do. So the idea of purgatory, particularly, but the idea that you're going to be punished unless you do what we're saying is right and what we want you to do, obviously played into their hands. That would be my understanding.
What do you think is the most dangerous or problematic issue that theologically conservative Christians hold to? And I'm talking about an issue or a position, not a person, a movement, or a party.
So really, this is the most interesting one for me. And like I said before, I almost reordered the questions because I know that people don't listen all the way through. And this is the one, that vanity to one side, though. But if somebody was to listen to my opinion on one thing, it would be this one rather than the others. I think that you will get some people who will give you what I view as superficial answers. Right. There might be important issues to them. They might be important issues, but it's sort of like a second layer. It's a sort of layer 2 issue, not a base layer, a sort of layer 1 issue. They'll talk about maybe women's rights or views on homosexuality or abortion or something like that. And of course, those are important issues, right, for people. And there are lots of others. But for me, that's not really the problem. I mean, people can have these different types of views outside of religion. The difference is how we tackle them. And this is the issue that I have, right, with religion, is that it steps outside, especially conservative religion, which is what you mentioned, is that it steps outside the norms with which a multicultural and secular society, and by secular society that doesn't mean non-religious, it means a society that affects answers to these questions based upon principles, based upon modes of understanding and discussion and commonality that are not framed on a religious framework. Not all societies do that. I listened to the Taliban recently. You've got to say, for all the crap the Taliban get, right, one thing you've got to say is they are pretty upfront most of the time. At least you know where you stand with the Taliban. And they were being asked about women's rights. And they said, we've no problem with women's rights. We'll uphold women's rights as long as it's in line with Islamic doctrine. Right. So you could see the primacy of their thinking with the Taliban. Now, most secular societies don't do that. You're allowed your religious opinions, but that's not how we hold discussions in the public sphere. The problem is often there's an underlying with conservative religious people. And the reason this is, there's an underlying mentality, there's an underlying justification which can't be approached, which can't be tackled, which is immutable. And which actually society, in a bid to be more and more progressive, is saying more and more, no, that's out of line. That's hate speech. You can't tackle people's religious views. You have to respect that part of it. And so we end up with this situation. Look, you could take this let's take abortion as an issue, but I'm taking that as an exemplar of this wider thing. So I could take a position, a more open position on abortion, let's say, and you could take a more anti-abortion, pro-life, I think you call it in the States. Now, so I'm the pro-choice one. And you could be not a religious person, let's say. You don't believe in God for the moment, Braxton, but you could still adopt the same position that you think abortion's wrong, and you could give these secular-sounding arguments, right? And we can have this discussion. So we might rate things differently in this discussion, okay? So I might I might base it, for example, we could have two different scientific understandings. I could have a scientific understanding that, as far as I'm concerned, from my way of viewing it, a fetus at 20 weeks is human tissue, it's alive, but I wouldn't characterize it as a human being because of my understanding of the science. You could read it a little bit differently and think that its central nervous system and its brain is developed enough that you do regard it as a human being. So we could arrive at different conclusions on different readings of the science. You could take a more philosophical perspective, and I'm taking a more scientific perspective, for example, and arrive at different conclusions. But nevertheless, we are at least our beliefs are based upon the things that we're arguing, right? So in other words, the arguments that underpin my reasoning are available to you to challenge, and the arguments that underpin your reasoning are available for me to challenge. Okay, so there's a certain commonality there, and that's how we try and engage in the public sphere. The problem that I have with particularly conservative religious mindsets is that it's very much a sort of Mott and Bailey approach going on here, which is that it's not even the Taliban. The Taliban would say, well, it's wrong because Allah says it's wrong. And that's it, right? Doesn't matter. I've talked to you, Braxton, about this or that. I'm talking as the Taliban guy. I've talked to you, Braxton, about this subject for 2 hours now. The arguments that you make, Braxton, they're very compelling. Very compelling, and on the basis of those arguments, I'd agree with you 99%. You couldn't have made those arguments any better. They sound a lot better than my arguments, Braxton. But the problem is that Allah says you're wrong, so it doesn't really matter, right? You've wasted your breath for the last 2 hours, because I don't believe what I believe as Mr. Taliban man based upon the arguments that I've just presented to you. I believe based upon what Allah says, and that's it. The rest of it is just window dressing. I'm making these arguments just to try and convince you. Your replies, that I'm immune to them because these arguments mean nothing to me, right? If you convince me they're all wrong, well, it doesn't matter anyway, because what matters to me is what Allah said. And this is the problem I have. Now, some religious people in the West claim to have a bit of this approach, that it's what God says, but they don't really mean it. It doesn't really work out that way. Case in point with gay marriage in the UK. Prior to it being legalised, when was that? 2013 maybe, I think. 70% of Catholics in the UK were opposed to it. Within 3 years, only 30% of Catholics. So 40% of Catholics, miraculously, I said that miracles don't happen. Within 3 years, 40% of Catholics presumably thought that God had changed his mind. That David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, knew more than their omniscient God did. And that blow me, David Cameron was right. That God was wrong all along. Who'd have thunk it? So they may have said, a lot of them, in 2013 or whenever it was, yeah, I'm opposed to it because God says it's wrong. But they didn't really mean it. They were actually more convinced by the actual arguments. But there are some Christians, the very conservative ones typically, for whom that is the bottom line. And this is the problem, is that if I now argue abortion with you, Braxton, and you're now arguing as a Christian, let's say, I don't know what your position is on this issue, it doesn't matter, but a very conservative Christian, the problem is that you won't be upfront with it. This tends to be the problem, because if you're upfront and you say, I'm against abortion because God says it's wrong, and that's it, well, it doesn't butter many parsnips, that. It doesn't sway many minds, right? The people who are going to enjoy that reasoning are already on board with you, right? It's not getting anybody new on board, is it? So it's not a very good line to take. So I understand why conservative religious people don't do that. What they do is they have this Mott and Bailey approach. That's really what their beliefs are based upon, is just God says it's wrong, or they think God says it's wrong, so it's wrong. And that's immune, that part of it is immune to challenge. That's off the table. And as I say, modern society is saying, with regard to non-Christian religions, it's colonialism and it's imperial, Western imperial, we're colonizing people if we should challenge their religious positions with regard to things like this. We're pushing it off the table. It's seen as offensive to challenge somebody's religion on these things. You can discuss the issues, the secular arguments, but the religious side of it you should just respect. But this is the problem. By putting that off the table, you're putting the chance that their opinions are now immutable. They're immune to change. But you don't know that because that's not the argument. That's the Bailey. The mot that they present are these secular arguments. So they can only win or draw. They can never lose. They can convince you if their arguments are strong enough, and you can say, oh, well, maybe you're right there. I'll change my opinion. But you can't best them, because even if you slam dunk every single one of their arguments, it doesn't matter, because that's not why they believe what they believe. They believe what they believe because they believe that God says X, Y, or Z. And that to me is a real problem, that kind of thinking. That kind of religious thinking. It doesn't just extend to Christians. There are many Christians who don't think like that, who you can have an argument on secular grounds, who accept that's part of being in a secular society, that the arguments have to exist purely on that layer because it's a multicultural secular society, right? Just my God says just doesn't really wash it. There are Christians who are like that. There are also, unfortunately, it seems to be a growing number of non-religious people who nevertheless adopt the same kind of thinking on a number of issues nowadays, which we've all seen in recent years. It's not the positions that are the problem, it's the fact that it's based upon a series of what they regard as immutable and unchallengeable truths, which nevertheless large swathes of the population don't agree that are immutable and unchallengeable. That's the problem. But you can't lives will be lost if you express that opinion, if you hold that belief. This has to be off the table, this question or that question, and it's just as damaging actually when secular non-religious folk do that. And that seems to be growing. That seems to be a growing mentality. And along with it, a sort of defense of religious mindsets, often from the same people who are most vigorously opposed to, and this is where it just doesn't square, it's some of the people who are the most progressive and woke, if you like, who are most opposed to traditional conservative religious perspectives, nevertheless defend faith and religious conviction as unchallengeable in some way. You can challenge the arguments, but you can't really challenge it when it becomes an act of faith, when it becomes, well, my God says it's true, therefore it's true, because that would be offensive, potentially, and you can't have that. It's kind of ironic that the people who hate those kind of views the most are the ones that want to put what underlies those perspectives off the table. But in terms of religion and conservative Christianity, that's always my biggest concern, is that when we're discussing things in the public sphere that involve all of us, right? If it's laws on how we treat different people or different circumstances, it impacts on me as somebody who doesn't believe in God as well as you does. And look, I don't know all the answers to that. This is why this makes this a really intriguing question, because I have a view on abortion, roughly in line with the law as it stands in the UK. Now, looking out from where I am, I see some pretty radical positions on either side. I've heard people tell me that quite literally it should be a woman's right to have an abortion at any time up until the moment of birth. It could be 10 minutes away from her popping that child out. If she wants it out of her body, then if it involves chopping the baby up to get it out, then that's fine because it's her body, so it's her right, and that trumps everything. And I don't really know how to talk with people like that, particularly. Okay. And so that's a problem. And then on the other side, I look at people who are very religious, and despite what I've just said about how much of a problem that religious attitude is, because it trumps everything else and it's off the table and it's often hidden, and it's hidden behind this series of arguments which are not the real arguments that underpin what they believe, and what they really believe is actually not challengeable because it's well, God says so, and that's the bottom line. If I believed, I have to look at it from another perspective. I don't believe that we're ensouled, right? It's pretty grim. I think reality's pretty grim. When I die, I'm dead. That's it. Why do I feel this sense of not wanting to die and all this stuff? Because I've evolved that. If I didn't, I'd have died out, and somebody who did have that sense would be the one that carried on. And so the issue is that my perspective is framed in terms of that. I just think I'm a mortal being, and when I die, that's the end of my consciousness. I kind of wish it wasn't, in a way, although there's no situation which would be really acceptable, because living forever is frightening as well. You know, dying is frightening, and not dying is sort of equally frightening in the long run. But that frames my perspective. But I accept, if I was a Christian and genuinely believed that at the moment of conception, that fertilized egg, let's say, is ensouled by God, and the ensoulment, the soul part of it, is what constitutes the person, right? That would alter my... If I genuinely believed that, then how could I not figure that in? I look at a small fetus, and I don't see that as a human being. I see it as human life, human tissue. I see it as alive, but I don't see it as a human being like you and me. But I can imagine if I believed that we were all ensouled, and that really this physical body bit just doesn't matter. It's this soul that exists outside the body that God has given us all. Well, I probably would feel a bit different about abortion. So how do we even begin to, I can recognise that. So how do we begin to have a discussion? We may as well be, well, we are. I was going to say we may as well be discussing two separate issues. We are discussing two separate issues. If somebody believes that, talks with me about abortion, we're not discussing the same thing, right? We're just not discussing the same thing. So I just, I don't even know how we begin to deal with that. That's kind of why I'm an anti-theist, Braxton. It's not because I hate people who are religious or anything like that, but to my mind, by anti-theism, it doesn't mean I want to kill theists or I want to force people out their religion. It means that I think that the world would be a better place with less religion, with less God belief. That's why I think that. Because then we can all talk to the same ground rules, or at least there's a possibility. You're still going to have these people, like we're seeing a lot in the last 10 years, who create new sort of dogmas, who create new unchallengeable truths, unfortunately. But at least there's a chance. Wherever religion is there isn't a chance, because it mandates these things. It insists on these things. It says, no, God says this, and that's the final word. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you think's moral and what think's immoral. If God says the opposite, then that's it. That's the final word. It doesn't matter what you think. Your thoughts, your beliefs, your morals that are in your brain count for absolutely nothing. You can debate it till the cows come home. It doesn't matter, because what God says is the final word. It trumps everything. It trumps common sense. It trumps logic. It trumps the whole goddamn lot. It's very difficult to deal with that. These individual issues are just individual issues. This sits underneath all of it. It undermines all of it, as far as I'm concerned. And that's the biggest issue that I have. Okay, that's it. Be well. Thank you, Braxton, if you've listened to all of this. I enjoy these 10 questions and answers things. I hope this finds you well. I hope it finds all my subscribers well. To those that are patrons of my channel, thank you for your continued support. What I aim to do a bit more. These 2 videos are going to be pledged. I aim to do a lot more short videos which aren't pledged, just talking about stuff like I used to do back in the day. Not feel that everything has to be a sort of pledge video that's long, it's got a lot of time and thought gone into it, where I go through things in detail, or nothing, right? Because that sometimes precludes me from doing anything if I'm too busy, if I've got a lot going on in my life. Okay, that's it. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you for watching and listening. Bye for now.